right down the street, so I was here quite often. So it brings me great pleasure to be here again and to kind of, share some of the few things that we may have tonight, inshallah. So let me go ahead and get started with this. And where I wanted to start was that, when it comes to speaking about doubts and what we call shubuhat specifically, in the grand scheme of things, I think I've been dealing with this topic for, let's say, 15 to 20 years. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is not only in the context of Muslims, but also in the context of non-Muslims, how to answer certain questions, how to approach people, how to do away with people's doubts. And in that relatively long period, because I'm dating myself now, so anyway, in that relatively long period, I can say there were 3 occasions where I was either completely stumped or I had to think about it for some time. And inshallah, I'll be going through those 3 occasions, some today and some tomorrow, inshallah. But let me start with the first one, and this is actually very recent. I was just speaking with our sheikh, and he was mentioning, like, so, you're with Sapience now, and I was with another organization called IRA, and IRA does a lot of da'wah work, specifically to non-Muslims. So one of the things that happened when the pandemic hit, there's no more kind of direct personal da'wah. There's no sort of direct one-to-one, go out in the streets, talk to people, university campuses. So we had to shift online. And what happened was that we started a chat service where people could log on from all over the world and just start asking questions about Islam. And we wanted to, and alhamdulillah, we had relatively good success. So I was on one of these chats, and someone came on, and I still remember, that they said that, look, I've been researching Islam for quite some time. And the thing is that I really like what I have studied. Now pause here for a second. When someone says that, hopefully that should make us happy, right? Like, okay, so this person, inshallah, Allah is going to guide them. So they proceeded and they moved forward. They said, and I've accepted Islam. Okay, alhamdulillah, this person has accepted Islam. Wonderful. So now the discussion proceeds, and and they start asking about resources for new Muslims and things like that. And we have some resources online, New Muslim Academy, and so on and so forth. And then they say, but I have a question that I'm having a lot of trouble with. I want you to, and this is one of the ones that stumped me, and to this day I don't have an answer. They said that when I was searching for Islam, I was actually very depressed, and I was going through a lot of hardships in my life. And I had found Islam in the middle of my gender dysphoria. Now, gender dysphoria, for those of you who may or may not know, it's basically the idea that you are born with a certain anatomical reality. You are a male, right? But for one reason or another, you feel that you're actually a female, or vice versa. You're born as a female and you feel that you're a male trapped in a female's body, okay? So this person said that I was in the middle of this, and I had gender reconstructive surgery and hormone therapy. Now, if you're seeing where this is going, meaning they had surgery to biologically change their gender. And in addition to that, hormonal therapy. So they're in the middle of this process, and they said, so now that I've accepted Islam, when I visit the masjid, which side do I go on? Okay? I was stumped. I'll be really honest. No idea. I have no idea, and I still don't have any idea. So I asked some of the people that I knew, some of the mashayikh, they had no idea. Okay? So to this day, I'm still asking people, and they're still like, yeah, that's a tough one. May Allah make it easy for the imam of that masjid. My point is that we are living in a day and an age in which you're going to see matters you've never thought of before. And you're starting to see those things, and those things are leading to serious doubts, not only in this, let's say, non-Muslim sphere. As Imam Ahmad was mentioning, that this is also creeping into the Muslim sphere. You have, as you probably know, certain masajid that are opening up that are specifically geared towards the LGBT community, who happen to say that they're Muslim or whatever it might be. You have a number of issues that the Muslim community is starting to now see, and one approach could be the approach of the ostrich, where you stick our head in the ground, inshallah it'll go away, and we keep going. But what we wanted to do was take a proactive approach. So the Sapience team, the organization I work for, we spent about 2 years constructing this course, and this course is much longer than just tonight and tomorrow night. It's actually a full 2-day course. Alhamdulillah, I was able to fly out to Turkey, professionally record it myself, Hamza Zortzis, and so on and so forth. But the point is that this is a much needed course, and it's not only for the imam of the masjid to deal with these issues. It's not only for the students of knowledge. It is also for the parents that when their kids come home and they start asking them challenging questions, questions that they may have never heard, to be able to give them the tools to be able to deal with those questions. What we would say the epistemic, psycho-spiritual tools to be able to deal with those questions. So the first thing I wanted to clarify in terms of what is this course about, there's an adage that we have at Sapience, right? And it's very popular. They say if you give a man a fish, he does what? Eats for a day. Okay, one person knows this adage. All right. If you teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. So this course and what we're going to be discussing is not about going through every single doubt, every single shubha, and answering each and every single one. Because if that was the case, we would be here for a few years easily. But what this course is doing, it's not giving you fish, it's teaching you how to fish, meaning we're going to be looking at certain fundamental, foundational principles that will give you the tools that you need to be able to navigate shubuhat, navigate doubts, right, when you see them. And these tools generally, they're spoken about in sometimes very general terms. So these might be things that you might already know, but in reality, once they're kind of clarified, it'll empower you. So that's basically the objective of the course, is not to just give you a fish, but it's to teach you how to fish, to give you the fundamental principles. Okay, do you mind if I walk around? Because I feel very constricted, I don't know what your policies are here, but anyways. Okay, so let's take a look. Just like any course, this course has prerequisites. So the prerequisites for the course, the first one I have up there, stand in the possibility that you will change and your doubts will be gone. If you recall, the title of the course was no doubt 10 strategies to deal with your and other people's doubts. So maybe you yourself are not going through doubts. Maybe you're very secure. Alhamdulillah, it's by the tawfiq of Allah, you're secure. But it's to train you and teach you how to deal with other people when they have doubts as well. So one of the first things you need to do, if it's yourself, to stand in the possibility that the 10 strategies, inshallah we'll be expounding about those tomorrow in a lot of detail, that they're going to work. You have to be coachable. You have to come with a predisposition and this idea that indeed these strategies, if I implement them, that they will in fact work. They will be able to do away with my doubts if I'm going through doubts. And if you're speaking to someone, you need to kind of have them be in that sort of predisposition state. In other words, that state where I'm willing to accept what you're going to say, right? That leads me to the second point. Do not superimpose intellectual and emotional baggage. Because one of the main things that cuts someone off from guidance would be those presuppositions. And sometimes those presuppositions, they have nothing to do with, intellectual arguments. In fact, if you think about the reason why people don't accept Islam, what would you say would be the number one reason? Let's get a little interactive now. I don't want to be talking all night. What is the number one reason you think people do not accept Islam? They think it's strict. Okay. Emotions? What do you mean by emotions? Okay. Emotional reactions. What else? Sorry? Fear of judgment. Okay. Unpleasant interaction with Muslims. Yeah. Islamophobia. Interesting. You were going to say something? Okay, the way some Muslims act. Okay, fair enough. Those are all good answers. But if you were to ask me, what is the reason, what is the main impediment for a person to enter Islam, to accept Islam, I would have to chalk it up to spiritual diseases, and specifically one spiritual disease. And the disease is ego. Because if you think about it, right from the very get-go, the quintessential being that rejected the truth was who? Shaitan. What was his problem? Was it rational? Did he not have the intellectual capacity to be able to understand things? No, he knew way more than perhaps everyone combined in this room. What was his impediment? Ego, arrogance, yeah, kibr. That was his impediment. Keep going. Throughout history, Fir'aun, what was his problem? Abu Jahl, what was his problem? They came to Abu Jahl and what did they say? They said, look, this man, the Prophet ﷺ, do you not feel that he's on the truth? Is he not a prophet? What does he say? He doesn't say, well, look, rationally, he's mistaken on these 3 terms. He didn't say that. He said, no, we've had competition since the very beginning. He's from Banu Hashim, we're from Banu Makhzum. He's from, the Hashim tribe, and we're from the Makhzum tribe. And whenever we would compete, they would give the Hujjaj water, we would give the Hujjaj water. We would match. And now they are claiming that they have a prophet and that this prophet is sent by Allah. How can we compete with that? I will never accept him. Abu Jahl was his original kunya was Abu al-Hakam, to be a wise person, to be someone who's intelligent, intellectual fortitude. So what was the problem? Ego. So the reason I'm mentioning these things is one of the main things that has to be done when you take a course like this, or when you're speaking to someone's doubts, is to have them be in this state to say, look, don't superimpose your own emotional and intellectual baggage. You have to be coachable. You have to be able to kind of come with an open mind and an open heart. Otherwise, these strategies are just information that you're getting. Okay, now, understanding the difference between abstract knowledge and being. What do you guys think that means? What's the difference between abstract knowledge and being? Hal and qal. Okay. Let's expound upon that. What does that mean? Thank you. Knowledge about something versus the application of that particular thing in your life. All right? I'll give you an example. There's a secret. The secret is that I don't have a six-pack. Just want to let you guys know that, okay? The thing is, though, I could tell you all the steps needed in terms of nutrition, in terms of working out, cardio, calories in, calories, I could tell you all of that. So I have all the knowledge of the ability to get a six-pack, but I don't have a six-pack. So this is what we're talking about here, is that there's a difference between abstract knowledge and there's a difference between actually being. When it comes to these strategies, you can't just take it as empty information. You have to become those strategies. You have to make it a part and parcel of yourself to implement them such that they become a part of who you are. Your being has to change. So don't take it as just information that you're going to take home, you put in a notebook, and you seal it away. You have to be open to have that change you, if this is going to be something that will transform you. All right, I've mentioned you go through the full course. That means come tomorrow. I think the benefit of coming tomorrow is some sort of food of some sort. What are they ordering tomorrow? There's food tonight, but then there's something special tomorrow. I don't know. Imam Ahmed was mentioning something. But anyways, some really popular restaurant. I don't know. I'll let him. All right. I mentioned, and this is kind of, we mentioned this earlier, epistemic duty, intellectual humility. We touched upon that. Having this humility, and it is let's say that we're coming from a non-Muslim context, we would say that it's an epistemic duty. Like if we understand that things should be understood rationally, even from that perspective, you have an epistemic duty to come to the topic with humility. Okay? And when we get into what is epistemology, this will hopefully be clarified, inshallah. Now, this second last point, mature content, ages 16 plus. Why am I mentioning this? I'll tell you why. Some of the content might be a bit sensitive, okay? And I'm going to leave that to you as a parent and your discretion. Some of the content will be sensitive, but I will say that it is important that we speak about that content because you don't want to be dumb-sided. You don't want to be, your son or daughter to come home one day, speak about these things, and you're in an utter state of shock. So to be prepared for that, understand that the content will be mature. We will be speaking about things that can be culturally, socially sensitive. So my recommendation is that if that will be a concern of yours, then consider that my kind of, what I would assume or what I would say would be a good age would be 16 plus, okay? That's in terms of the content, the maturity of the content, and also the intellectual maturity. some of the concepts we're going to be going through may not be understood by someone who's younger. They may be. I've done this course, and a 13-year-old was blowing past a lot of the adults, was like, wow, mashallah, this guy's like, he's going places, right? But in general, the last point, and that's what we call, that's what I'm saying, a note on language. So here's my note on language. Number one, I've got up there, trigger warning. There are certain things that I may speak about that you might fundamentally disagree with at your core. And so you might disagree with it at your core, so much so you might say, okay, this guy needs to be kicked out of the masjid, all right? This is, like, it might come to that point. What I'm gonna say is, hang on to that. Let me finish the point in its entirety. Because remember, one of the things and one of the obligations we were saying about coming with, releasing your intellectual and emotional baggage, this is part of that. So I'm gonna say, don't get triggered. Just hang on. Give me the excuses that I need to make my point, if that makes sense, right? As Muslims, we give each other excuses. You have to do that, inshallah, especially in a course like this. The second thing, we're going to be using some difficult terms. One of the critiques we have about this course is that a lot of the terminology is very difficult. And I said, look, it's true, some of the terms are going to be difficult. We're going to be defining those terms. But understand that when you're, if this is a young person that's going to, let's say, college, they're going to need to be equipped with that very terminology, with that very language, okay? I'll give you an example. I taught this course on atheism we have called The Divine Reality, and I did it at UT Austin. Any Longhorns here? Nobody? Okay, anyway. So, UT Austin, if you know anything about UT Austin, it's a liberal school. And so one of the guys in the class, I remember we went through a certain argument called the argument from dependency. It's also called the argument from contingency. It's a very rock-solid argument. Once you understand it, very powerful. Okay, so, and then I think we went also through the philosophy of science. And then, one of the students there, he goes, look, I understand what you're saying, and it sounds good, and it's very powerful. But my professor is just so intelligent. He's able to articulate himself, and it's just, I'm not sure how to deal with that. That just seems like he just seems right. Based on what? I asked him, is it that his arguments are convincing? He said, no, it's not that the arguments are convincing. It's just that the fact that he sounds erudite and educated and sophisticated, that's the reason why it sounds good. And so yes, there's going to be difficult terms in here, but those difficult terms are to equip you to deal with these issues because language is important. And that takes me to my third point, and that has to do with rhetoric. So let me give an example about this. Well, before I get to that example, what do we mean by rhetoric? It goes to the point about language and the importance of language. It's not only what you say, but how you say it. And sometimes how you say something can be even more important than what you're saying. I'll give you an example. And this is what we talk about in English in terms of rhetoric. So who's heard the phrase Bond, James Bond? Anyone? We are still in America, right? Okay. Okay. All right. They say that particular phrase is one of the most epic phrases in cinematic history. Okay? But what information is that phrase conveying? It's a dude's name. Okay? He could have said it in 4, 5, 10 different ways. He could have said, hello, I'm James Bond. He could have said, my name is Mr. Bond. He could have said, I'm James. Okay? But the fact that he goes, Bond, James Bond, A, B, A, that's a rhetorical device. You see that in many places. Home sweet home. What does that convey? I mean, what sort of depth, deep wisdom are you getting from those phrases that have on that structure A, B, A? But it's a part of English rhetoric. It's a rhetorical device. And the point that I'm making here is that if we don't understand the fact that rhetoric has importance and has kind of this weight, we won't be able to move forward. So language becomes very, very important in this. So yes, there'll be difficult words. Yes, we're going to be talking about certain what they call the etymology of words, the background of words. But all of that is important to empower you and to give you the tools that you need to be able to deal with doubts. Let's take a couple more examples. Imagine if I told you that Sheikh Ahmed over there, he came in yesterday wearing thongs. Imagine if I said that. Sheikh Ahmed over there came in yesterday to the masjid wearing thongs. Okay, hang on there. If I said, for the majority you understand, or for the people who understand what thongs are, would you be somewhat offended at that statement if I said that about him? Yes? Yes, okay, so the people who know what that is, Sheikh Ahmed might be offended as well, right? Okay, here's the thing. If I made the same statement halfway across the world in Australia, no one would be offended. You want to know why? Because thongs in Australia, it's what they refer to as flip-flops. You know those sandals you buy in bulk, you take for Hajj so you can lose 1 million of them? Those things. They call those things that you wear on your feet thongs. So if I said that same statement in Australia, no one would bat an eye, right? So context and language become very, very important to understand the context that you're in, the language that you're going to be using when you're addressing doubts. One more, and we're going to return to this one. Religion. What does this mean? And so I have a thesis that I'm going to be presenting a little later. That the term that we find in the Quran, deen, is not religion. But what do we mean by religion? What's a religion? Someone give me some examples. Okay, well, give me an example of a religion. Okay, so what's an example of a religion? Christianity. Okay, anybody else? What's another example? JazakAllahkhair. Any other example of a religion? Okay, all right, that goes against my thesis, but okay. Yeah, yes, Sheikh Ahmed. Fashion. How many people agree that that's a religion? No, okay, you've got some ikhtilaf here. Yes, someone else had their hand up. Oh, you agree that fashion, okay. Mm-hmm. So you're saying religion is that which really happened? So does fashion not really happen? I mean, maybe not. Not for me, maybe tonight. I mean, Imam Ahmed can rock stuff really nicely, mashallah, tabarakallah. But yeah, so you're saying, okay, so it's tied to belief, you could say. All right, so what, yes? Okay. Okay, okay. Okay, good. Yes? Sorry? Moral code. Okay, so these are good, but what I'm asking, what are some examples? If someone said religion, what's the first thing that comes to your mind after Islam? Put Islam on the side for a second. The first thing that comes to your mind. Halal, haram? Okay. Judaism, Buddhism, yes. You're going to say Buddhism, all right, he took yours. All right, on this side, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Hinduism, what else? Veganism. Okay, that might be a contentious one. All right, we're going to come back to this point because this point is actually fundamental in the sense that what do we mean by religion? How is it used in language? And it forms a certain view of the world, okay? And we'll come back to this point. All right, so what are we going to cover? So now that's just the introduction. What are we going to cover? The first thing we're going to cover is what's known as the metaphysical backdrop. Now again, we're starting with those words. Don't let it fluster you. Metaphysical is just simply, to make it very easy, it's something that's beyond the physical, okay? So when we talk about things like our consciousness, our inner subjective states, the soul, God, the afterlife, these are all metaphysical concepts, okay? And what we're going to be speaking about in this section is that every single person has a metaphysical backdrop, all right, which we're going to term as a worldview, and we'll get there in a second, okay? But that's where we're going to start off with, a metaphysical backdrop. We're then going to move on to the nature of the heart, because as we're going to see, these doubts that we're speaking about are not things that can be cured only by rationality. Okay, how many people think that if you just think about something hard enough, you can remove the doubt? Hey man, just if you think so. How many, okay, you have one. Okay, good. JazakAllahkhair. How many people think you need something more than rationality? Ah, okay. How many people think you don't need rationality? Okay, good. So we're gonna get into this concept of the nature of the heart. We're gonna look at the concept of rationality. We're going to look at what's known as cognitive limits. Every human being has cognitive limits, just like every human being has ocular limits. Ocular meaning that which you see. So I can't see what's going on in my masjid that champions right now. Okay? Why? Because I have ocular limits. I have auditory limits. I cannot hear what's going on down the street in the neighbor's house. I have auditory limits. For some reason, when we bring up cognitive limits, everyone goes berserk. But we freely accept ocular limits, and we freely accept auditory limits, but when it comes to cognitive limits, there's a certain issue. And remember that point I was making about ego? We're going to come to that as well, inshallah. So, we're going to be speaking about the nature of the heart. We're going to look at some of today's crises and challenges. What are some of the things that are prevalent today that if you open a classical book on Aqidah, you won't find? Things like feminism, postmodernism, liberalism, social liberalism, and so on and so forth. All of these isms. We'll speak about some of them. Then we'll move over to the source of some doubts. People were saying earlier on that how someone's treated when they come into the masjid, a bad experience with a Muslim, right? So we're going to look at what are the sources of doubts. Are they simply just someone that can't, through some sort of process of cogination, thinking about something too deeply, they're just going to get to the answer? Or are there other sources of doubts? Was it, someone that they ran into in the masjid? Was it a philosophical issue that arises or a scientific issue that arises? Or is it a moral issue? The issue of slavery, the issue of, underage marriage, or whatever it might be, that there's a whole list, a whole slew of moral issues that can cause someone to have doubts. So we'll look at the source of some of those doubts. And then we will go in earnest through the 10 strategies. And I'm not going to list all of them now, but those are the 10 strategies. By the way, how many people registered for the course? Okay, so if you have not registered, I would highly recommend you do that, because that way I can send you the notes, and you will also get a copy of The Divine Reality, which is a book on atheism, very powerful book, highly recommend it, okay? So the place where you'll go is a website, nodoubtcourse.com. Okay, go there, make sure you click the Masjid Maryam link, don't click any other link, because then you'll be in the Sacramento group or some other group, and register for the course. Okay, moving on. Let's start with the metaphysical backdrop. And let's start with something we call a worldview. So before I give you the definition, what is a worldview? What do you think a worldview is? It's really not that hard, by the way. So what do you think? What's a worldview? Yes? The way you view, thank you very much. All right? Not complicated yet, all right? So, a worldview, all right? It's a noun. Definition of a worldview from Merriam-Webster: a comprehensive conception or apprehension of the world, especially from a specific standpoint. Also called Weltanschauung, all right? That's a German word. Basically, a worldview is how you view reality, okay? So now that might seem like, wait a minute, that sounds very philosophically dense. It is the lenses by which you view reality, okay? Let's get it a little bit deeper now. All right, so I've taken this from James Anderson, and he says, a person's worldview represents his most fundamental beliefs and assumptions about the universe he inhabits. It reflects how he would answer all of the big questions of human existence. Fundamental questions about who and what we are, where we came from, why we're here, where, if any, we're headed. The meaning and purpose of life, the nature of the afterlife, and what counts as a good life here and now. And here's the important thing. Few people think through these issues in any depth, and fewer still have firm answers to such questions. but a person's worldview will at least incline him towards certain kinds of answers and away from others. So what is he talking about? When we say fundamental questions, we're talking about questions that we, in a sense, already know. Questions like, why am I here? Where did I come from? And what happens when I die? Those are your kind of your foundational questions. You know, we give the example in the divine reality, and I usually tell people, like, as a thought experiment, imagine that as you're listening to me speak, all of a sudden you black out, right? You know this example, yeah? So all of a sudden you black out. Now, when you wake up, you're on a plane, and you're sitting in first class, all right? I've never been in first class, by the way, but I'm assuming it's really good. Okay, you're sitting in first class, and the temperature is perfect, right? The seats are really comfortable. The scenery outside is absolutely beautiful, right? It's like that orange hue, it's just perfect. And after a few minutes, the person comes with food. And so whatever your favorite food is, for me it would probably be steak. So I'm not a vegan, for that, whoever that person was, right? So it'd be steak. So you smell the food and you eat it, and it's like the best steak you've ever had. It almost melts in your mouth. So whatever food it is, biryani, whatever you like, you taste it and you're on another level, okay? Now here's the thing. You were sitting here, you blacked out, you wake up on a plane. Would you be happy? You got the steak, comfortable seat, beautiful scenery. Would you be happy? What? Okay, so you'd have a nagging question, wouldn't you? I was sitting in this class, or I was sitting in the masjid, and all of a sudden now I'm on a plane. So one of those nagging questions would be, what? Where am I going? Where's the plane going? Right? Any other nagging question? How did I get here, right? Like, how did I get here? What else? What? Who are you? Oh, who's the that's a new one. I haven't heard that one. Okay. Who's the flight attendant? All right. What else? What other nagging questions would you have? Why am I here? Okay. How did I get here? So if you think about life as being this metaphorical plane, you come into a state of consciousness at a certain age, and it's like you're on this plane. You have fundamental questions. How did I get here? Where is this plane going? Right? And what happens when I get to my destination? And so on. So if you think about life like that, few people think about these questions. For Muslims, those questions are very straightforward. How do we get here? Allah created us. What's the purpose? Why am I here? To worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Where are we going? What's the eschaton? We'll get to that word in a second. We're trying to get to Jannah, of course, right? There's an afterlife, in other words, right? That's where this plane of life is going. Those are what we're talking about, the big questions, okay? And few people think about those things. So when we get to doubts about Islam, we have to understand that there are things that precede those doubts, that come before those doubts. That if they're not settled, then you're going to be arguing in a circle, okay? So let's continue on. So worldviews shape and inform our experiences of the world around us. Like spectacles with colored lenses, they affect what we see and how we see it. Depending on the color of the lenses, some things may be seen more easily, or conversely, they may be de-emphasized or distorted. Indeed, some things may not be seen at all. Your worldview, it's like if you have glasses on. You're wearing, let's say, glasses that have lenses that are green. And I'm wearing glasses that have lenses that are red. And now you come to me and say, that tree is green. I'm going to fight you tooth and nail to tell you that tree is red. Why? Because the lenses that I have on won't allow me to see that tree is green. And that's what a worldview is. It is the lenses by which you judge and understand reality. And here's the other thing. Every single person has a worldview. No one is worldview-less. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Every single person has lenses by which they judge what is real and what is not real. Every person has a worldview. And I would love for someone to challenge me on that. Okay? All right, and that's the next slide. Everyone has a worldview. Think of it like this. Everyone has a worldview like everyone has a language. Everyone speaks a language, right? There's no person that's language-less. Everyone learns a language, speaks with a language, Either it's orally or they think in a certain language. But every single person has a language. No one says there's no language. But here's the thing, and this is what I find really interesting. They say that the United States has the largest population of monolingual population. Meaning that in the US, we have the largest population of people who only speak one language, right? Which is a slight disadvantage when you're studying languages themselves. If you have studied 2 languages, or you know 2 languages, or 3 or 4, it puts you in a position to be able to analyze other languages. If you studied Arabic, you can study sentence structures. You know, for instance, in Arabic, you're not limited to just noun sentences or nominal sentences. You have verbal sentences, right? In English, we don't have those, unless you're Yoda, in which case, all power to you, right? Going to the market, are we? Whatever, right? The point is that the fact that you have another language gives you the ability to judge one language or another. And of course, this judgment isn't something that has real-world consequences. Whether you speak Arabic or Urdu or Spanish or English, it doesn't have consequences. But your worldview has consequences. Which worldview you adopt is going to have moral consequences, theological consequences, consequences on your marriage, all sorts of things, okay? So everyone has a worldview. Another way of looking at this, everyone has a worldview just like everyone faces a direction. How many people here can say, I can face no direction? It's not possible, right? Even if your eyes are closed, you're still facing some way. You still have to look in a direction or be in a direction. You cannot be directionless. There's an ayah in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِكُلِّ وِجْهَةٌ هُوَ مُوَلِّيهَا. Everyone has a direction towards which he faces, right? فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. So race to all that is good. Point is, this ayah, does anyone know what the background of this ayah is? About? Okay, kind of. Yes, thank you. It was about the Qibla, the direction that you're going to turn, right? Was this an issue for some of the Muslims at the time in Medina? Who's got the background here to like bring it home? Yes. Exactly. They thought their previous deeds would not be accepted. They're changing the Qibla. Now, I want to ask you a question. Sitting in the 21st century in Sugar Land, Texas, does it seem like a big deal? Okay, you're facing this way, you're facing this way. Okay. What's the big deal? It doesn't. But you understand you're sitting from a 21st century, modern perspective that says, if you're facing this way, you're facing this way, what was the big deal? But you understand for them, it was a worldview perspective. The implications of a Qibla being changed had monumental consequences when you look at it from the perspective of a worldview. Are you saying now, from our worldview, that the salah and everything that was done can now be in a different direction? It seems minor from the vantage point of the 21st century. But if you were to go back at that time and understand their worldview and how they understood reality, it was a major issue. Now, the reason I brought this ayah also is because it says everyone has a direction towards which he faces. Yes, the context is the Qibla. But even in general, everyone literally has a direction in which they face, right? Okay. In Ma'rif al-Quran, it says, it is, the commentators point out, an observable fact that every traditional community has had a religious orientation of its own, whether appointed by Allah or chosen by itself. There is not, just like a direction, a worldview has to be there. Whether that worldview comes from Allah or whether that worldview comes from humankind. But everyone has a worldview. Okay, Ibn Kathir, he says, this talks about followers of various religions. We'll get to this point in a second. Every nation and tribe has its own qibla that they would choose, while Allah's appointed qibla is what the believers face. He continues on and quotes another ayah. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعًا وَمِنْهَاجًا. And to everyone we made a sharia, a law, and a manhaj, a method. Every worldview has a system, has a breakdown, has components that you can judge something to be true or not, that you judge something to be moral or immoral, okay? So now here's the question. what are the components of a worldview? And that's what we're going to speak about next. All right? Well, actually, before I get there. So worldviews also largely determine people's opinions on matters of ethics and politics. What a person thinks about abortion, euthanasia, same-sex relationships, environmental ethics, economic policy, public education, and so on depend on his underlying worldview more than anything else. You could have an opinion about abortion, but if you don't understand the worldview that person is coming from, you could be arguing till you're blue in the face, right? Your worldview is going to determine how you understand these concepts, what sort of judgment and value judgment you place on these concepts. What is your opinion on abortion, right? If your worldview dictates that the human being owns themselves, and therefore the female owns herself, then your worldview would dictate that the woman has absolute right upon her own body. If your worldview dictates that at a certain point the child in the womb of the mother has rights, then your worldview will cause you to have a different opinion. But all of that is based upon how you view the world. What are those? So before we get to morals and ethics, there's a whole list of components that come before those opinions. Whether we're talking about euthanasia, abortion, same-sex marriage, whatever it might be. Okay. So what are the main components? All right, so this I took from Dr. Carl Sharif, JazakAllahkhair, and he kind of breaks down the components of a worldview. All right, now I know there's some words on there, we're going to go through that. Number one, and what you'll notice also is that there's a certain color scheme, there's a color hierarchy here. So you find the darker ones on top, and it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. Okay? The reason why that's like that is because you have kind of the more important components of a worldview, and eventually you come down to the less important concepts within a worldview. And what you'll notice is the things that people argue about here in morality and ethics, same-sex relationships, abortions, euthanasia, they actually come way down the list. Then you get law and politics, all right? So what's the first thing? Ontology. Ontology is the study of being. What we're asking now when we are studying ontology, we say what exists and what does not exist. Yeah. Sure. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So, right. Yeah. Right. Sure, okay. So hold on to the point about truth and falsehood, because that's going to come up later too, okay? When we talk about what's real and what's not real, actually that's my first point, which is ontology. In other words, what exists? You said, okay, he's real. Okay, how do you know he's real? So, how do you know your brain is not in some vat on some planet and the scientist? So you understand? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. But what I'm saying is just an example. When we talk about ontology, these are the things that we deem to be real or we deem to exist. Okay? So you said, does he exist? Okay, so this is a question. Now, you're sure he exists, all right? But then that moves us to our next part of the worldview, which is known as epistemology, the study of knowledge. How do you know he exists? What are the sources of knowledge, right? So there's one thing to say, yes, I affirm that he exists, right? Or I even affirm I exist, right? But then how do I know that? So now you've got ontology and epistemology. And these are two things that are closely tied in the sense that one is about what exists and what doesn't exist. Do I exist? Does the tree outside exist? Does the masjid exist, right? Do certain concepts exist? And then the next part of the worldview would be what we call epistemology, the study of knowledge. How do we know this thing exists? How do we know truth and falsehood? What are the sources of knowledge, right? And so depending on your answer, your ontological answer to the question what exists, okay? And then your epistemic answer to how do I know that exists and how do I know truth and falsehood and things like that, then you'll actually move on, and then you'll have a certain part of ontology, which is what is known as theology, which is the question of, does God exist? Okay? So if your answer to does God exist is yes, then you have a theology, which I've placed above ontology, because obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the highest, right? But it depends on your ontology. If you believe Allah exists, then you have a theology. Who or what is Allah? Who is God? What is His nature? What is His names? What is His attributes? So on and so forth. But even that has an epistemology. How do you know that about Allah? Right? So epistemology is how you know what you know. What are your sources of knowledge? For the Muslim, what are our sources of knowledge? Quran and Sunnah. Okay, what else? Yeah. A little bit louder. The Imam. So I wouldn't say the Imam is a source of knowledge. Yani he's a source of knowledge to tell you your kind of your higher level sources of knowledge, right? Fair enough. Okay. The five senses, thank you. Here's the thing. If someone denies the first source of knowledge, in other words, what we talk about, revelation, Quran and Sunnah, then the rest of the questions that we were speaking about, morality and ethics, that's going to have a bearing on that, right? So before we get to the topic of abortion and slavery and all these other topics, if these questions are not answered, what is your source of knowledge, moving on and try to justify it, you're going to be in trouble. I'll give you another example. How many people, and this is a bit of a controversial one, but the students who took the divine reality know this one. How many people think that the Quran has scientific miracles? What's up? Doesn't seem like a right term. All right. How many people think that there are, I don't know, what else do they call those? Fair enough. It describes cosmology. But does anyone think that actually has miracles related to science? Let's put it that way. Okay, fair enough. Anyone else want to chime in? Does the Quran have scientific miracles? Yes, hold on. Yes, does it? Okay, what do you mean by that? Hold up a second, guys, 1 second. Yes, what do you mean? Okay. Okay. Got it. Okay, good. Yeah. Got it. Okay, fair enough. So for those of you who didn't hear what he said there's things that we know through science that affirm what was already in the Quran, right? But this actually forms an epistemic problem, and a severe epistemic problem. And you guys were in the right area, by the way, because I wasn't asking about cosmology and things like that. I was asking about this idea, right? That you have certain things that are discovered in science that now, you can look in the Quran and say, wow, وَالْجِبَالَ أَوْتَادًا, right? The mountains are like pegs. But I'll tell you an interesting thing is that if you go to a geology professor today or someone who's an expert in geology, they might disagree with you and say, like, modern day geology actually runs antagonist to this idea of mountains being pegs. We actually have theories related to tectonic plates. So clearly your ancient book is wrong. But again, this goes back to a fundamental concept that has to do with epistemology. How do you know what is true? What is your source of knowledge? Okay? So when someone says that we're going to use science to prove the Quran, they're making a faux pas. They're making a mistake. Why? Because science is a mutable endeavor. You are always discovering things in science, right? And so when someone studies the philosophy of science, they see that there are things like the limits of observation. There are observations you could make in the future that contradict current conclusions. That's how you get scientific paradigm shifts, right? The quintessential example of that is, the idea of us going from a worldview that determines like a geocentric worldview, right, that we have today, to we have a heliocentric worldview versus a geocentric worldview. The fact that we understand the sun is the center of the universe as opposed to the earth being the center of the universe. Oh, okay, I thought you were about to. JazakAllahkhair. All right, so that's one issue. Second issue, the concept of induction. When we speak about science, it is done in a way that what we call, it's an inductive method. It's not a deductive method. So a deductive argument would be something like if you have two premises and a conclusion. If I said, you know, the one that I usually quote is, you know, that all presidents of the United States were men, premise one. Joe Biden is the president of the United States, premise two. Therefore, Joe Biden is a man. That's a deductive argument. If you agree with premise one and premise two, the conclusion has to be correct. Science does not work like that. It works on induction, where you have a sample set that you generalize. I've observed 20,000 crows and they're black, therefore, limited data set, we've generalized. We made an inference, okay? So therefore, crows are black. But we don't know for absolute certainty that we will never find a pink crow. It can get you to a high level of certainty, but it can't get you to absolute certainty, right? And that has to do with what are the sources of knowledge? What is the epistemology that science as an endeavor relies upon? The sources of knowledge are the natural world, and that's it. And that's something known as naturalism. Yes? Yeah, that was actually, and this isn't a course on the philosophy of science, but that's another contention. Because the other contention is, well, science works, we have an iPhone, so therefore, but just because it works doesn't mean it's true. Quantum mechanics deals with that issue, right? Anyways, I don't want to get too deep into this. The point is, what your sources of knowledge are components of your worldview. For the Muslim, there are two sources of knowledge: the natural world and revelation. So our epistemic borders are very vast compared to the epistemic borders of someone that is outside of the Islamic worldview, because they can only rely on the natural world. Okay? All right, so that's epistemology. Anthropology. Here we're not talking about the anthropology you study in university. What we're talking about here is who or what is man? Is man a material being? Does man have a soul? Is that a component of the human being? Right? What constitutes a human being? So that's when the answer to this question has ramifications. If a human being doesn't have a soul, that has ramifications, right? If your worldview, for instance, dictates that the human being is only material matter, there are a number of questions that arise. So someone has a discussion on human rights, for instance. Okay, but someone could ask a foundational question. Who made those rights rights? What gives the human being value? If you say there's no soul, there's no external component of that, meaning there's nothing that transcends the human being. In other words, there's no God, let's say, and it's only just flesh and blood, then what gives me more value than, say, this mic? If we assume that, yani, right? Because at the core of it, this mic is just material matter. It's a collection of atoms and molecules that have been kind of come together in a process that is blind, random, non-rational, and non-intentional. And so have I. So what gives me more value than this mic? Sorry? Okay, so even if I have an intellect, why does that give me more value? Yeah, why give that value? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. 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 But who says that has value? No. The survival of the fittest, why is that valuable? Yeah, that's what, but how do you rationally justify survival of the fittest having value? There's no value, right? So the point is that if you think the conception of the human being is such that it's only material value, you're into a whole set of issues. The whole concept of human rights gets thrown out the window, philosophically, right? So, who or what is the human being? So a component of your worldview, who or what is man? Who or what is a human being? Anthropology. Another component, teleology. Teleos comes from purpose. What is the purpose of the purpose of the universe? What is the purpose of man? What is the meaning of life? You know, all of these questions have to do with teleology. And if you're, depending on your answer to your teleology, your purpose, why you matter, that's going to have ramifications on other areas. But that forms your worldview. If you say that your life has no purpose in kind of that higher level viewpoint, right? Meaning, okay, you have a purpose, you want to join the NBA, and inshallah, you're going to make it to whatever, right? But that's just a current purpose. We're talking about the general, like what happens after you die purpose, right? The overall purpose, the overall meaning. How you answer that question is going to have ramifications, right? It's going to have a certain conceptualization of how you look at the world, okay? All right, after all that, then you get to morality and ethics. So once you've understood what is ontologically, what exists, what doesn't exist, how do we know, right? What are the sources of knowledge? Who or what is the human being? What is purpose? After you've now figured all of that out, then you come to those areas that we love to fight about, having to do with morality and ethics. But if you don't understand the worldview that you're coming from, or the assumptions you've made, then arguing about those things or having doubts about certain issues of morality and ethics can be very problematic. Okay? Now, once you have morality and ethics, what is right and wrong, then you get into law and politics, all right? Because obviously, law and politics is based upon a certain conceptualization of what is right and what is wrong. And I've added in there aesthetics. Even your conceptualization of what you consider to be beautiful. When I say the word art, what comes to mind? Someone help me out here. When I say art, paintings. All right, what else? Art class. Expressions of emotion and thought. What comes to mind when we say art? Hold on. What do you guys think? Movies, theater. Okay. Anybody else? Like when I say art, what comes to mind? Poetry. Okay. Here's the thing. Remember we were talking about language? Even your conceptualization of what the term art refers to, most of you spoke about visual arts. Did you notice that? Movies, art, paintings. And a lot of that has to do with a throwback to a worldview that's based in Christianity. Why? Because in Christianity, the word becomes flesh. And so within the Christian, European, modern world, you have a big concept that has to do with art related to the human body, the paintings of the human body, and so on and so forth. You think of Michelangelo and all of these type of things. But from an Islamic worldview, the idea of beauty actually has a starting point related to the auditory. The focus isn't the ocular, it's the auditory. Why? Because the word is what? Quran, the recitation, the beauty recitation. That's why in an Islamic worldview, you find the idea of poetry being very profound and very real and very important. The point of language being very important, right? All of that is just based on a worldview, and it's based on one word that I said, art, in the English language, in the 21st century, in the modern age. So even aesthetics are based upon your conception of the world, okay? And they form part of your worldview. Okay, any questions about this? There's a lot, right? Okay, good. I wanted to give you your money's worth. No one paid for this, right? I'm just checking. Okay, alhamdulillah. All right, any questions about it, though? Yes? Yeah. So what I'm saying is that it's going to depend on your audience, right? If you're speaking to a 12-year-old, you start going through this, halas, he's checked out, right? He's not going to, but for your own understanding, this person comes with a question like, why is it that, why would Allah not allow homosexuality or homosexual acts, let's say, right? Okay, what's the background to that question? Before you start getting to, well, the thing is like this, and you have to understand there's a whole set of assumptions that precede the question. So it behooves us to understand what are those assumptions. So they could be, these are the technical terms for them, but as long as you have an understanding, okay, hold on a second, before we get to that question, where do we get our morals from, right? What is the source of knowledge? Like, is our source of knowledge only the world around us? And so on. Having an understanding of these concepts equips you and empowers you to deal with those questions. Because most of the time, if you start to just answer the question, you're going to be in trouble. Because they're coming from a different worldview. Yeah. Yeah. In a sense. Possibly. Right. Right, exactly. Because we don't know the assumptions. So we don't know, okay, what are the sources of knowledge? Is the Quran and Sunnah a source of knowledge? Maybe. Or maybe for this young person, it's not. They haven't been convinced of it. So the problem isn't the question. The problem is, okay, the source of knowledge, right? The existence of Allah. Okay, if there's no concept of the existence of Allah, then we have to deal with that because that's going to have implications on morality and ethics. Does that make sense? Right? So I'm not saying you're going to, have a 12-year-old sit down and be like, okay, let's start with ontology, then theology, then teleology, anthropology. It's not but the point is, if you have an older crowd, like someone that's going to college, then this schematic might actually come in handy because then you come off and you understand rhetorically that you're sophisticated and you can engage with concepts that they're going to be engaging with in their universities and colleges. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yes, exactly. Right. Is up, yeah. Yes. Sure. That sounds like a good analogy. Yeah, absolutely. Like we love jumping into answering questions, especially when it comes to Islam. Let me tell you why. But you gotta hang on. Yeah. 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 The first generations. Sure. So I have an argument in this area. An argument, not meaning I'm trying to argue with you, but I have a thesis. And that thesis is if you start going through the Quran from a worldview paradigmatic perspective, this idea of a paradigm, you'll start seeing those things come up, like just automatically. And that's why we're going to start talking about why I don't think the term deen should be translated as religion in all contexts for that reason. Because the word deen actually, I would say, is more closely attached to this idea of a paradigm or a worldview than it is to the limiting idea of a religion, right? So if you understand it from that perspective, then yes, they didn't have these technical terms, obviously, but they had that understanding, right? In addition to that, you mentioned this concept of like, okay, so Islam spread and they didn't have like kind of the hyper-intellectualization that maybe we're going through today. But at the same time, what I would say is that they did have a spiritual component to that, right? And we're going to see in a little bit that part of solving people's doubts or your own doubts, it has to do with something that's more than just rationality. It has to do with spirituality. But we're going to get there, inshallah, in a little bit. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, so maybe, sure. Yeah, right. Because the ethic of the time. Yes and no. So I would say that the disagreements that came up were probably in the area of theology. Yes, ontologically, we're on the same idea, right? That's God exists. Where you come into problems is theologically. But then that also has ramifications on everything else. Like this interesting, and I'm trying to think of the reference, Dr. Jonathan Brown, in his book, Misquoting Muhammad, he gives the kind of a letter that was sent to one of the Christian Byzantium kings. I think it was from one of the Umayyad leaders, one of the Umayyad caliphs. And basically, he was arguing with the Byzantine leader to say that Jannah has pleasures. And the Christian was like, that's impossible. Now, the evidence for that was totally based on his worldview. Meaning it had nothing to do with, okay, let me rationally prove this, but only because he has been centered in a Christian worldview, he could not accept that there are actual sensual pleasures in paradise. You know? But again, it goes back to how do you conceive of reality? How do you conceive of the world around you, right? So yes, it wasn't hyper-intellectualized, you know, very early on. Later on, it did actually get to that point. When you started having interactions with the Byzantium Empire and the Persian Empire, all of that philosophy starts to come into the Islamic realm, right? And that's where you get the Mu'tazila and so on and so forth, and these other groups, right? So very early on, I agree with you. This type of hyper-intellectualization probably wasn't there, right? But they had something else there, which I would say has to do with spirituality. And again, we're going to get there, inshallah. All right? Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is for us to just take a break and stand up, stretch, because I know I've covered a lot, because we've got concepts that are going to be 10 times as hard. No, I'm kidding. They're not going to be that bad. But just take a break, stretch. I know it's a lot. Sorry? Timeline. What do you mean by timeline? So we're supposed to be here till 10. Yeah. Well, that's right. So just scroll all the way down to see all the courses. Okay, everyone stretched? Ready to go? Because I only have an hour left, so got a lot to cram in. No, I'm kidding. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let's move on. All right. Let's do a comparison of worldviews based on some of the concepts we spoke about. So what I'm going to be looking at is the Islamic worldview and juxtaposing that with the modern worldview, all right? And by the way, there's also a postmodern worldview, but we won't get into that today, most likely, okay? So what I would like us to appreciate, however, is that when you start comparing worldviews, what we're going to see is that the Islamic worldview is very heavy in content. It's very rich. It's almost, pregnant with content, you can say, right? So there's a lot there. When you start comparing it to the modern worldview, in each one of these categories, you're going to see that there's a lot of bankruptcy in the modern worldview, all right? So let's take a look. We'll start with ontology. Under the Islamic worldview, there is a concept of Allah. There's a theology. Under the modern worldview, it's a question mark. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. Moving on, under the Islamic worldview, is there an unseen realm that exists? Yes, alim al-ghayb, right? Angels, jinn, barzakh, ruh. In the modern worldview, completely denied. The supernatural, expand it? I'm not sure how to expand it, man. Like the actual slide? They're too small. Okay, maybe it's just really far. Usually the slides are like all the way up here. I think so. Basically, that just says supernatural world, it's denied, right? The seen realm, alam al-shahada. Yes, we have that in the Islamic worldview and also the modern worldview, the empirical, natural world. Okay, so both Islam and the modern world have that. Resurrection and judgment, al-ma'ad, all right? Moral accounting, heaven and hell. JazakAllahkhair. So this is what we call an eschaton, meaning eschatology is the study of what happens in the end, right? What happens when you die or what happens at the end of the world. So for the Islamic worldview, these concepts are very clear. There's a resurrection, there's a judgment. There is a moral accounting, meaning when you do something good or you do something evil, it has meaning because there is an accountability for it. Whereas in the modern worldview, because there's no identifiable eschaton, in other words, there's no concept of a afterlife or moral accounting after you die. Yes, you have a concept of morality, but it doesn't have meaning because it's not attached to something that transcends life. Okay? Finally, cosmos, human life infused with purpose and meaning, objective meaning or teleology is denied. What's the purpose? Nothing. We're here by random accident. The processes that we came here by have no intention behind it, have no rationality behind it, and they're just random processes, right? So therefore, there's a teleology is completely denied, right? And you know what's very interesting? There's a professor at UT, Dr. Robert Koons. He wrote a book called Materialism, very fascinating book. And he actually argues that to deny teleology, you would deny the most of the professions and functions that you have as human beings. So if you take something like medicine, if you say there are no purposes on a micro level, meaning organs don't have specific purposes, the very project of medicine is undermined. You have to assume teleology. You have to and he's Aristotelian. In other words, he's a big fan of Aristotle, and so for teleology is a big thing for him. Nevertheless, point is, overall in the modern worldview, ontologically, there's no objective meaning or teleology. It's denied. All right? So this is in the realm of ontology. Again, appreciate how rich the Islamic worldview is versus how bankrupt the modern worldview is. Okay? Moving on. Epistemology. Under the Islamic worldview, revelation, wahi, tanzil, Quran and Sunnah. Modern worldview, nothing. Sense experience, what in Arabic is called hiss, right? We have that in Islamic worldview. We have in the modern worldview, we have sense experience. Reason, what's known as aql in the Islamic worldview. Both in the modern worldview, they use reason. In Islamic worldview, it's also used. Here's a very good one. The idea of testimony, testimonial knowledge or knowledge by way of testimony. It is foundational in the Islamic worldview. Yes, you have the concept, but it's not conceptually central. What do I mean by testimony? So let me take a step back here. Testimony is getting knowledge or acquiring knowledge based on the say-so of somebody else. Okay? And the point is that if you say that this idea of testimony is not part of your epistemology, you run into a number of issues. All right? And sometimes, the example we give, we say, How many people here believe the world is round? And the rest of y'all are flat earthers? Is that what's going on? All right. So here's the thing. How do we know the world is round? Sorry? A lot of proofs? Okay, wait. What are your proofs? Okay, like? Okay. Okay. So, how do you know that? You would directly observe that? You have observed what exactly? Okay, like? And so, how did you interpret that to mean that the world is round? So you interpret that to mean the world is round. So there couldn't be any other possibility. It couldn't be like a flower shape. Yeah, or some other shape. But why do you think it's round? Is it solely based on that? Or is your interpretation of that, does it come only from you? Okay. Are you sure it's just logic though? Because logically, could you not then say there are other possibilities? Yes, it could be round, like a sphere. What's up? Logically. I don't know. I'd have to see that, man. So you have done, but I'm not talking about flat earth. I'm talking about, yes, okay, we agree, it's round, but I'm saying, is it a sphere round? Or is it round like, okay, it could be a different shape? Yeah. Like, is it round in terms of like round, or is it like kind of like stretched at the center? Like, there's a number of, sure, okay, but I'm saying like there's a number of possibilities, right? Again, I'm not arguing for flat earth. All I'm saying is that, yes, we know the world is round, but we know that by testimony. That's the only way to know that. You cannot say, logically, I can get to the conclusion, unless you have gone to outer space and observed it yourself, to know that it's a sphere, right? But the only way you know that is by way of testimony, right? Unless you yourself have done the calculations, which are based on what exactly? Because remember, calculations were done in a certain paradigm at a certain point in history to assume a heliocentric view of the world, of the universe. And those are also based on logic and calculations. So unless you have a direct observation, you're kind of stuck. No, I'm not saying geocentric. Or geocentric, I'm sorry. Yeah, geocentric. So my point is that there's no way to do away with testimony, right? A more foundational exercise. How do you know your mother's your mother? Anyone want to take a crack at that? She told you, right? I mean, you know though. Others told you. Right. The only way you know that is by way of testimony, whether that's photographs, whether that's whatever it is. Those photographs, you didn't take those photographs on your way out, okay? So, so in other words, you understand someone else took those photographs, right? Even the earth being round, yes, maybe you can make an argument of calculation, but again, that's going to be a very difficult argument to make, I think, just based on paradigm shifts. Okay, fair enough. But genuinely, most people generally understand the world being round by way of testimony, right? So, yes. DNA test. Oh, I love that one. Okay, so have you done the DNA test? You've done the DNA test? So, wait, you've done the DNA test? Okay, how do you know they're valid? So what is the science behind it? Or how do you know the science behind it? How do you know the science behind it? Come on, man. He's trying to skirt away from the issue and say, look, man, I read it. That's the reality. Here's the thing. No one can do all the experiments themselves. It's just no one has the sheer capacity to do that. You don't have the time to do that. You have to rely on the say-so of others. Right? Even in the realm of science, the majority of knowledge you have does not come from you yourself doing the experiments. The majority. You have to rely on experiments that were done by someone before who relies on someone before that, okay? Now, that's not explicit within the scientific method as it's taught in Western academia, right? But it's still a fundamental part of how you know what you know, whether you want to accept it or not. Sure, sure. So here's what I'll say though. Fine, there is a concept of testimony, but it's not central, and that's why the point up there says it's not central to, because the general conception is, well, yeah, you could replicate the test, right? Most people may or may not, yeah. Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, you could say that in a sense, that maybe they accept only mutawatir narrations, right? But even that, I would say there may be some ahad narrations that they accept on the idea that you can replicate the experiments, right? Point being, it's not central to the methodology, right? Whereas from an Islamic worldview, it is central, right? Testimony forms a part of how we know what we know as a central concept, right? And someone that says, okay, well, those are just stories and fiction and fairy tales, you'd have to start with the very concept of testimony itself and say, are you denying testimony entirely? Or are you saying that there are ways in which we know something to be true or not by way of testimony? Because if we're talking about the idea of assessing testimony, there's no system that is more sophisticated than the one you find within the Islamic worldview. Let's just be real about that. Even academically, peer review, those peer review, we don't know anything about the person that reviews them. We don't know their family background, who they were, where they lived, what their motivations were. Maybe you know the company that sponsored the study, in which case you can assume certain things and say, oh, that's why these conclusions came out, right? And you can enter into the realm of conspiracy. But the point is, that sort of robust system that you find within the Islamic framework, you're just not going to find it within modern academia, especially when it comes to areas like history and social sciences. You're really stuck, right? Okay, anyways, I didn't want to go on that tangent for too long, but okay, so Islamic worldview in terms of epistemology, khabar and khabar sadiq, report, not conceptually central. Here's one, the fitra and spiritual intuition. In the modern worldview, you may have a concept what we call first principles. All right, those are like axioms or axiomatic truths. All right, we'll get into that in a second, which again are not things that are stressed. You never hear about those things in the sense that, okay, these are my assumptions. Okay, but we'll get there. Like, what are the things that you assume? There are a lot of things that you assume, by the way. You assume you exist. You assume that people have other minds, but those are all assumptions, right? There are certain mathematical assumptions that you have to assume you cannot prove. And we'll get to that in a second as well. Okay, let's look at anthropology very quickly. So you have the concept of the body. We also have the body. In the modern worldview, there's a mind. In the Islamic worldview, there's a mind/heart. So we have concepts like aql, qalb, fu'ad, lub. In the Islamic worldview, there's a soul, there's a ruh, there's a nafs. The soul is a question. In the Islamic worldview, and I find this very interesting, the concept of language being central, whereas language is not central. Why do you think that is? So, under who or what is the human being, I have up there in the Islamic worldview, language is a central quality of the human being. It defines the human being in a sense. Whereas in the modern worldview, it's not central. Yes, you have linguists, Noam Chomsky, whatever it might be, and they have certain studies they do in linguistics, but it's not a central concept like it is in the Islamic worldview. So why? Okay, good. So the Quran gives us that basis. Yes? But is that true though? Like, do you not? So even in society, do we not have linguistic faux pas? Like where we say something and we mean something else? Like, think of it this way, and I think this is an interesting exercise. They have this idea that they say words have meanings, right? Is that the saying? But in fact, meanings have words. What do I mean? Because if you think about all of your internal subjective states and what you feel and what you experience, and then your ability to express them is actually limited, right? So everything you feel inside, sometimes, people say, like, I'm struggling to find the words. You must have heard this, right? And you yourself may have experienced this. Like, what was the word? Like, how do I express this entire reality inside of myself, right? Even as something as mundane as, like, describing how a chocolate cake tastes. It's an inner subjective experience, but there's only a certain limited number of words that you can put together to describe the taste of the chocolate cake. But you can never get to the exact taste, you as an individual. So point is that, in fact, even within the modern worldview, our language is actually very important. They may not say that it's very important. And so hence, because language is this kind of part and parcel of the human being and its importance, from an Islamic worldview, it has a lot of importance. You mentioned the Quran. But even beyond the Quran, language itself, there's an entire corpus of study that gets into language. That's why language is so sophisticated in the Islamic worldview, right? You have 12, 13, 14 sciences that are related to language. You have etymology that's related to language, sarf and nahu and balagha, rhetoric, and so on. And you have all of these sciences that get into, then you have the history of language itself. How did language originate? You have many areas within the philosophy of language itself, right? Wittgenstein is a big name, right? And so all of these areas within the philosophy of language, yes, they're studied, but they're not central. Whereas in the Islamic worldview, if you don't have the tool of language, and specifically understanding the Arabic language and the context in which it was spoken and and the Quran was revealed, you're at a severe disadvantage on many things, right? So language is central to the Islamic worldview. Okay. Sure, go ahead. Okay, what do you mean? Sure. Sure. Yeah, of course. Okay. Equal in both the modern worldview and... So what I'm speaking about here is when we're understanding language as part and parcel of the human being, right? Because remember, what constitutes the human being under the worldview, under the modern worldview? Okay? If it's language, you run into a serious issue. Because how do you understand language as a phenomenon, as a philosophy, right? For example, one of the issues that, like materialists have to deal with is how is it that a child can acquire grammatical structures that are grammatically sound without without any sort of direct information transfer, right? Because you eventually understand grammar almost intuitively. But how does that work under a materialist worldview? Where does that come from? It's a big question mark. Like, how do you solve that? How do you square that circle, I guess, right? In the Islamic worldview, okay, you've got certain elements of that. You have Adam al-Islam, who's taught the names of everything. So you have a source for language itself. But the source for language under the modern worldview, which if we assume is primarily materialistic, it's a big question. Where does language come from? How is it we're able to speak language? We're able to articulate ourselves. It's a very difficult concept to deal with. And that's why you have, the whole field of the philosophy of language that has many different theories. Like, just to not, what's, from the Islamic worldview? I mean, there's a lot of theories within the philosophy of language, right? So one is the idea of convention, all right? So in other words, human beings, they have what we call levels of abstraction, okay? So in other words, you're going to classify like this thing as a bottle, okay? Now there's a certain sound that signifies that this is a bottle, okay, in the English language, all right? But if I was someone that speaks Chinese and I said bottle, it would be completely meaningless. So you have an attachment of a word to this particular item, right? Now, the thing is that is the concept of bottle, and we'll get into I don't know if I really want to go down this route because I'm going into, is the concept of bottle, is that a real concept? in terms of bottles, in the sense that all of us who speak the English language, we've categorized that thing as a bottle, okay? However, in a different language, there could be a different categorization, all right? So let's take a different example. That right there in English is a table, okay? In Arabic, tawila. In Urdu, mez. I don't know, what other languages are there? Spanish, what do you call it in Spanish? What? Mesa, okay. Now, those are all articulations of the same concept, right? However, our conceptualization of what a table is in the English language has certain defining characteristics. Maybe it has legs, maybe it has a flat surface, whatever. Whereas in a different language, that abstraction might be more refined. You not only have a table, but you have a four-legged table versus a two-legged table, which may be two different words. Right, and so that level of abstraction would cause a language to be more or less sophisticated. Your ability to express becomes more and more refined as your level of abstraction goes higher and higher, right? And this is why English, translating things from Arabic to English becomes so difficult, right? You almost have to have almost like this row of adjectives to describe things, to go from one to another. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. So yeah, all that phenomena. Yes, I mean, so obviously when you're speaking about the Islamic framework, we're going to be speaking about the Arabic language. That's very obvious. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the philosophy of language is only related to the Arabic language, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed that we speak different languages. And all of those have some sort of underlying philosophy by which we have this kind of social construction, right? Think of it like money, for instance. Like if I whip out a dollar bill, everyone accepts that it's worth $1, but it's just a piece of paper at the end of the day. So there has to be a social kind of agreement, even if it's not direct, that this word means this thing. So that social agreement, like where does that come from? How do you explain that, right? Obviously, from our worldview, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives that social agreement to be able to make languages in that way. But from a materialist point of view, how does it come that you have that agreement? It's a very difficult phenomenon to explain. Anyways, we're getting lost in a completely non-related topic. That was not the point. So let's just move on, inshallah. So language, moral responsibility, part of the anthropology. Moral responsibility, morally responsible being, but it's incidental. Yes, there's concepts of right and wrong, but again, they kind of lack meaning. All right. Now, this was the concept that I started with earlier. Does the term deen, is it equivalent to the term religion in English? No. Okay, why? Why not? Okay, good. Okay, what do you mean?
Like the actual definition of the word religion, you can find a denotation in the dictionary definition of the word religion.
Sure.
It's pretty it correlates with the Islamic definition as well.
Okay.
But then if you ask people what they think religion is,
Yeah.
you'll find a whole host of different answers that's based on their social convention.
Good, good. So, and that was my point when I was saying the focus on language. Because it's not about the dictionary definition, like what we normatively understand as a term religion, right? What it's supposed to mean, as opposed to what is the interpretation someone has when they hear the word religion. Okay, so these are two separate things. Yes, when you look at when we think about the background of the word religion itself, so there's a lot of things within the etymology of the word. It comes from religiaire, which has to do with obligations, and so there's a binding, there's an obligation. So many of those overlap with the concept of deen. Fair enough. But most people, when you go to them and say religion, there's an immediate comparison to, okay, there's the religious sphere and the non-religious sphere. There's the secular sphere and the religious sphere, right? That's generally how it's interpreted. So what I'm talking about here is that does the term deen, is it equal to religion? I'm not talking about the normative use of the word religion. In other words, how it's supposed to be used based purely on the language itself, based purely on the definition itself. How is it interpreted? And the problem is that when you say religion to someone, immediately in their minds, they've categorized Islam as one of the religions. Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, and all these other, what we call religions. But from a worldview perspective, this becomes problematic because Islam has something to say about ontology, epistemology, teleology, anthropology, and all those things that constitute our worldview, right? So it's going to depend on context. Another kind of problematic area might be within the American context when we speak about religious freedom. If we define religion, Islam as a worldview, we might run into problems as a practical issue, right? So in that context, you would have to say Islam equals religion for the political expediency, right? But again, as a concept, can we say deen is equal to religion? So there's a paper, Rushain Abbasi he writes, in the medieval Islamic understanding, it was religion, in the sense of how we understand religion, that regulated and delimited the secular realm, rather than the inverse, which, as many scholars have exposed, is central to the function of secular power in the modern world. In other words, in the pre-modern world, our conceptualization of religion, that was what defined the secular, what defined what is not religious, okay? Whereas in the modern world, it is the secular world that defines the limits of religion. What is public, what is private, right? What are the boundaries of religion? That's defined by that which is outside, which is what we'd say the secular. Whereas in the pre-modern world, you can say it was reversed. And that example that I gave about, the Byzantine emperor or whatever, because he was defining basically the secular, that area that's outside of what we call religious, by way of his worldview or religion, right? So that understanding, it becomes very important. The modern world gives the limits of what we consider religion by the secular, all right? So, okay, moving on. All right, I'm actually going to skip this because of time, and all of this. Okay, so let's get back to worldviews. So one can think of a worldview as comprising a number of basic beliefs which are philosophical equivalent to the axioms of the worldview considered as a logical or consistent theory. These basic beliefs cannot, by definition, be proven in the logical sense within the worldview. Precisely because they are axioms, they are typically argued from rather than argued for. However, their coherence can be explored philosophologically. So what in the world are they talking about? Any worldview that a person has to have certain assumptions that cannot be proven by way of logic, let's put it that way, that are not provable. They're what's known as axioms or axiomatic truths, or first principles, or basic beliefs, okay? Every single worldview has axioms, has things that you cannot prove, but you must accept. Does Islam have that? It does? Okay, so what I'm saying is the worldview, are there any things that our worldview is based upon that we cannot prove? Might be one of those moments where okay, maybe you should be kicked out of the masjid, but anyways, I get there. The word is proof. Sure, but what if someone says, okay, well, how do you prove the Quran's a revelation? Okay, yeah. Okay, can you prove deductive reasoning is valid? So the example that I always give, divine reality students who know this. I said the thing is that remember we were talking about cognitive limits, rational limits. And the thing is there's no theorem that is infinitely defendable. You can't say because this, forever, right? right? Because then you're in the realm of what's known as skepticism or extreme skepticism. You doubt everything, all right? The example I usually give, I said, imagine my son comes into the kitchen and he takes out a knife and I say, Abdurrahman, put the knife back. And he says, why? Okay, so now what's he asking for? What's a reason? He's doubt, right? He's like, okay, why? So I'm like, because it's sharp and it can cut you. He says, why? I'm like, because it's sharp. He says, why? I said, well, because the manufacturer made it that way. He says, why? I said, because it's used to cut things. He says, why? I'm like, because it can be used to cut fruit. He says, why? I said, because fruit has a better utility when it's cut so I can eat it easier. He says, why? Okay, how long can I keep going before I just tell him, because I'm your dad and that's what I said? Right? You cannot prove things infinitely. There's no theorem that's infinitely defendable. Any system, any theory, any sort of system of thought necessarily has certain things that is outside of that system that it cannot prove, but it must believe to be true. And actually even believe is the wrong word. It must know to be true. Any system. Okay? And that, in philosophy, we would call that axioms or axiomatic truths or first principles or basic beliefs. Every single worldview has first principles. Okay? You know, like, it's like, because someone may say, if we want to take this to its extreme, that I just doubt everything. Right? Like someone comes and says, you can't be sure of anything. Well, what do you tell that person? What do you think? Someone says, look, man, you can't be sure of anything. Are you sure? Right? So you made one thing that you have absolutely, that you feel that's true, but are you sure about not being sure? So the thing is, the problem is if you doubt everything, you have to doubt your doubt, which leaves you intellectually paralyzed. You can't go anywhere with that. So by necessity, you have to have something that is outside of your system. And so typically when people talk about rationality, they basically say that there's two types of rationality. Things that are rational and things that are irrational. A rational system or a rational statement would be something like, I am Fahad. An irrational statement would be something like, I am a married bachelor. Okay? Now, if you came to me and you said, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. How are you a married bachelor? And I was stubborn, and I said, no, I am a married bachelor. Prove it to me that I can't be a married bachelor. You might say something like, well, look, man, that doesn't make any sense. By definition, a bachelor is not married. And by definition, a married person is not a bachelor. And there's no Islamic exception to this, right? So the whole, like in Islam, we have 4 wives, that doesn't apply here, okay? So these are two things that they can't happen. But what if I'm really stubborn? I said, no, I am a married bachelor. You'd be like, look, man, these are two things that are mutually exclusive, right? Mutual exclusivity. You cannot have two things that are opposite existing at the same time. That is a logical principle. And then I say to you, prove the principle. You can't prove the principle. You assume the principle and you move forward. So you have to have something outside of rationality in order for rationality to work. That's supra-rational. It's outside of rationality in order for the rational project to even work in the first place. These are not irrational statements. These are things that rationality demands, that it needs in order for it to move forward. So the super-rational, if you want to apply Islamic parlance to it, you would say that from our perspective, that would be what we call the Fitra, that which is outside of rationality. So what's part of the Fitra? Part of the Fitra is logical principles. Part of the Fitra is aesthetic taste. You see something beautiful, right? This is not a logical argument here. We're not talking about logic. We're not talking about proving anything, right? You see a sunset, and your wife sees a sunset, and you're like, wow, that's beautiful. And she says, wow, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Prove to me rationally that that's beautiful. Like, it's not part of the conversation, right? That is a fitri concept. That is not as part of the super rational. It's not something you prove. Similarly, certain smells. You walk into a room, man, it smells great. Your friend walks in, smells nasty, man. Okay, but prove to me rationally that it smells good. I mean, there's not a question of rationality, okay? So, there are things that are rational, there are things that are irrational, and then there's things that are outside of rationality. And someone once gave the example, they said, rationality is You know, if someone said that I'm only going to rely on rationality, in other words, I need proof for everything, it's like someone who says that I have the perfect solvent. Okay? It can dissolve anything. But the question you want to ask that person is that what bottle will you keep it in? If you have the perfect solvent, you still need one exception, right? You still need a bottle to keep it in. So rationality, it is a great solvent, but you still need to keep it in a bottle. That's why the term absolute, that which is not soluble, that which is not solvable. And for us, when we say absolute, Allah is absolute. Allah is samad, right? So in a sense, by necessity, you need to have something that's absolute, that's not relative to something else, right? That's, by the way, that's also an argument as to why Allah is one and not many, because you cannot have more than one absolute in that sort of framework. Relativity itself demands more than one. Anyways, that's a separate conversation. Everyone good up to this point? Yeah? This is some really dense stuff, huh? Okay. All right. Okay, let's dig into the Fitra a little bit. What do we mean by the concept of Fitra now that we've opened it? So, just going back to tying it to worldviews, every single worldview is going to have something that it assumes that it cannot prove. Okay? For us, that's the Fitra. Okay? And so we're going to see why that's the case. All right. So what do we mean by the Fitra? First of all, we've given a working definition here, the original normative disposition. Now, before I get into each one of these terms, the concept of normativity, who knows what that means? What do you think? What do we mean by normative? Normally accepted as convention? Okay. The majority of people. Okay, maybe. Yes. The default. Okay. Any of the sisters? What do you take a crack at normative? What do you think? Okay. Very good. What we consider normal, just to make it, less less scary, right? It can be juxtaposed with the term descriptive. So normativity, when you say normative, it's how something describes itself. When you say Islam, what is the normative understanding of Islam? How does Islam describe itself, right? It is, you can say in a sense, it is prescriptive. It is what should be. Now, a descriptive understanding of Islam that's not normative would be the Muslims and how they act upon Islam. You understand the difference? So someone could come to you and say, oh, in Islam, you people beat your women. Okay, maybe there is a Muslim man who beats his wife, but that's not a normative understanding of Islam, right? That's not what Islam says about itself. You understand the difference? So descriptive versus normative, okay? So normative, what is normal, how the thing should be, how it describes itself. Clear? Okay, versus being descriptive. Okay, now let's get back to our I was about to say normative definition. Let's get back to our working definition. The original normative disposition, right? And by the way, the term fitra is one of the most difficult things to define, only because even within Islamic texts, you don't have a distinct definition. So now taking that and moving it into English, it makes it 10 times harder. That's why I said working definition. We'll just use this for now. So the original normative disposition, we start with original. The word comes from the Arabic triliteral stem fatara. All right, so we see this in the Quran. Afillahi shak fatir as-samawati wal ard. Can there be any doubt about God? And here they said creator. What it should say is originator. The original, the one that originates, creates ex nihilo, out of nothing. Right? So there's a concept of creating things out of elements that are already there, right? Which is what human beings do when they say create, right? You make a table out of like the wood, and the wood comes from the tree. But creating out of nothing, ex nihilo, is a function of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, to create out of nothing. And that's what we mean by fatir, that he is al-fatir, he is the one that created, the originator, okay? So we said this is the original normative disposition. We're talking about originality from this perspective. Number two, in a hadith related by Abu Huraira, he says, on the night of ascension, the Prophet ﷺ was presented with two vessels, one full of wine and the other full of milk. The Prophet ﷺ looked at both of them and he chose the vessel full of milk. Jibreel alayhi salam, the angel Jibreel, said, all praise is due to Allah who has guided you to that which is natural, for had you selected the wine, your nation would have been led astray. The words in the hadith, Alhamdulillahi alladhi hadaka lil fitra. All praise is due to Allah who guided you to the fitra. So here's the question that some scholars ask. Why is it that the milk is considered equivalent to fitra? Anyone want to take a shot? Thank you. That's what you drink when you're a baby. It's the thing that you naturally incline towards. You naturally incline to suckle with your mother, right? From another perspective, when the milk enters the stomach, there's a concept of fatara. It tears open the stomach, right? So there's a concept of splitting and cleaving open the stomach to be the first thing that goes into it, right? So this term fitra has to do with being original from that perspective. The milk is the first thing that goes in, and you naturally incline towards milk. And when the milk enters the stomach, it's the first thing to enter, which opens and cleaves open the stomach, right? So we start with this idea of original, that it's the first thing, basically. Okay. Now let's move on to normative. We spoke a little bit about it. The term fitra, for those of you who study Arabic, it's what's known as an ism al-hayya. Ism al-hayya is basically the way you do something or the way something is done. So other words like this would be qibla, the direction you turn, the way you turn, right? Khilqa, the way something is created. Jilsa, the way you sit. So fitra is on that same sort of pattern, right? It is how something should be, how the human being should be, the normal state of the human being, right? And so there's the hadith that's usually related to this. The Prophet ﷺ said, no child is born, but he is upon the fitra. His parents make him a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian. And this last part of the hadith is in fact very important. As an animal delivers a child with limbs intact, do you detect any flaw? Meaning you have an idea of an animal that has flaws and an animal that is normal. So the concept of this is how it should be is part and parcel of the human being. Does it make sense? Yes. Yes, you could. So here's the thing. The normative idea, right? The idea of what's normal is that you recognize and appreciate and value goodness, right? Because if you take the Christian understanding that everyone is born in a state of sin, you would elevate the value of evil. So in the sense that when you give charity, why do you feel good? Well, you feel good because your normative natural state is one of goodness. That's how you were created, right? The deviation from that, and you're correct, is when you sin, right? Okay. By the way, there's a whole section that we get into, which is called the ontology of the human being, where we talk about the concept of the ruh, the fitra, the nafs, and how all of that is connected. I don't know if we'll get to it tomorrow, but we'll see, inshallah. All right. So, and by the way, why does this term normative come up? Because when you start having doubts about things like transgenderism, you have to be able, and that's why, by the way, the term normative can actually be a really bad word in certain circles, right? If you said, I'm heteronormative, for some people, they're like, wow, how could you possibly such a thing? Anyone know what heteronormative means? It means you consider heterosexual relationships to be normal. And you consider those that are not heterosexual to be abnormal, right? So this idea of normativity is very important, right? That fitraic understanding of what is normal is very important. And that's very pronounced and very clear in the Islamic framework, the Islamic worldview, okay? All right, so it's the original normative disposition, all right? And another example I used to give, then is the one who walks upside down. أَفَمَنْ يَمْشِي مُكِبًّا عَلَى وَجْهِهِ أَهْدَى مَنْ يَمْشِي سَوِيًّا عَلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. Is the one who walks upside down on his face better guided, or the one who walks upright on a straight path? If you looked outside and people were walking upside down, immediately what would come to your mind? That's not normal. That's not how people walk, right? So the concept of there being things that are normal is really important, especially in the day and age we live in. When it comes to things like gender, when it comes to things like sexuality, when it comes to a number of different things. And we'll see a couple of them right now. All right, going back to normative, the ayah, right? So direct your face towards the deen Hanif. And Hanif is a difficult term to translate. Hanif, yani, that which inclines towards the truth and away from shirk. So it inclines towards tawheed and away from shirk, right? But continuing on, فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا, that adhere to the fitra upon which Allah has created all people. What I find really interesting, it says, لَا تَبْدِيلَ لِخَلْقِ اللَّهِ. There is no change should there be in the creation of Allah, right? ذَلِكَ دِينُ الْقَيِّمِ, and so on and so forth. But, so can this fitra, can it be changed? So you say no, based on what? Yeah. Okay, who agrees with that? Can the fitra be changed? Who agrees with him? You agree with him? So the fitra cannot be changed? You do agree with him? It can or cannot? It cannot be changed. Agree? Oh, so we're all in agreement, this front row. Anyone disagree with him? Yes, you disagree. Okay. So you say that the fitra can be changed. Cannot be changed. Okay, that's what they're saying. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. What? Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting one. Okay, yeah. It's a very good point. Everyone heard that? What about the hadith we just read? Right? Every person is born upon the fitra, right? Kullu mawludin yulidu ala fitra. Every child is born upon the fitra. And then his parents make him a Jew, a Magian, or a Christian, or whatever order it was, right? The fitra. Al-fitra. Because fitra itself, if you do it in a, not as a, what's the word I'm looking for? If you take out the THE, right, the definiteness, a fitra is not part of the hadith. It's the fitra. Because al-fitra, like, things can have a fitra, a natural state. Like the animal has a fitra. Here we're talking about al-fitra, the fitra, right? Okay, so what we're asking is, can that be changed? So our brother here brings up the evidence and says, wait a minute, but the Prophet ﷺ said that his parents are the ones that make this person a Magian, a Jew, or a Christian. So doesn't that indicate that the fitra can be changed? Stray away from the fitra, okay. Yes, I'll get him and I'll get to you in just a second. Yes? Okay, so it's the interpretation of the parents. Yes. What are you going to say? Okay. So, like, give me an example. What do you mean? Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, so the fitra, are you saying that it okay. So, but does that mean the fitra itself changes? Or does it stay the same and it just has some influence? Or I'm not sure how you're trying to... Yes, I mean, thank you. Like the ayah is right there, man. Right? There's no change in the khalq of Allah, right? Right, okay. But what I'm saying is, here's the issue. And here's the issue with translation. What does it say in Arabic? La tabdila li khalqillah. Does it say la... What? What's the word for another word for change? Yughayyir, right? Taghyir. Does it say taghyir? No, it doesn't. What is tabdil? What's the difference between these two words? You see, if I say, like I have a water bottle, okay? If we consider this the fitra, I cannot change this water bottle for another water bottle. La tabdil. You cannot do a badal. You can't completely get rid of the fitra and replace it with something else. But can you change it? Like, can I take off the paper from here and make it into a different label? Sure. There's a difference, right? So the point is again, it goes back to translation, right? Like the English says, yeah, there's no change, bam. You know, someone reading this, like, yeah, there's no change, bam, it's right there. But again, there's subtle nuances that have to be looked at, right? Okay. So, it can be changed, but it cannot be replaced. That's what I'm trying to say, okay? In fact, shaitan is the one that orders people to change the creation of Allah, right? We know this from the Quran as well. I think the ayah, it'll come up in a little bit, right? But that's what we're talking about. The creation of Allah here is la tabdila li khalqillah, and their shaitan is asking you or commanding you, right, to do tughyir to the khalq of Allah, right? So some mufassirin interpret that to mean that that there can be a change in the fitrah. That being said, to be fair, there are some scholars that say the fitrah can't be changed. But they run into the problem of the hadith then. How do you explain it, right? So again, with my bottle analogy, right? You cannot replace the entire fitrah with something else, right? Every human being has a fitrah, or the fitrah. It is, but we're talking about completely replacing. Yes, it is a type of change, but you cannot do a complete badal. You cannot do a complete exchange, right? So maybe exchange is a better word. You cannot remove and replace it with something completely different, right? But you can make changes to it. Yes, exactly. Because look at it this way. Your fitrah forms the basis for certain fundamental conceptualizations. Like the truth being virtuous. Every human being recognizes that. Like, that's why everyone looks for the truth, right? Even at a very fundamental level, when you're doing science, you're looking for the truth of the matter, right? Now, if someone says that, and they understand from a kind of a intuitive sense that, yes, truth is better than falsehood. But just that very concept of truth being better than falsehood, where is it? It has to be a fitri concept, right? So anyway, so that cannot be replaced altogether. Yes, it can be changed. The idea is, okay, well, in this particular context, maybe I don't have to be honest. But as a general conceptualization, generally human beings agree that we need to come to the truth about the matter, whether it's something that's, you know, an experiment we're doing, or whether it's something that's has other moral implications, right? Okay. Let's continue on with the fitrah. All right. Again, we're talking about normativity. So the Prophet ﷺ mentions that there are 10 among the fitrah acts: clipping the mustache, letting the beard grow, using the toothstick, snuffing water in the nose, cutting the nails, washing the finger joints, plucking the hair under the armpits, shaving the pubes, cleaning one's private parts with water, and rinsing the mouth. This is in Sahih Muslim. What significance is this? What relation does this have with the fitrah? Meaning, right, the concept of cleanliness is a fitri concept, right? Which can be corrupted, which can be changed. I'll give you an example. Mysterio. Anyone know who this is? Jake Gyllenhaal? Maybe I'm in the wrong audience. You guys are very pious and, you know, you guys don't watch movies and stuff. All right, so this guy played Mysterio, a very famous actor. Check out what he says. He says, more and more I find bathing to be less necessary. At times, I do also think there's a whole world of not bathing that is really helpful for skin maintenance. All right? And we naturally clean ourselves. All right? And so on and so forth. All right? So, but he does brush his teeth, yani. So he does have at least that. And it's just natural. Just by the fact you exist, you just naturally clean yourself. No, not fitra. What I'm trying to say is, the fitra aspect is that we understand cleanliness as being part of washing and cleaning and doing these acts, right? It's a normative understanding. But again, you can always have people that say, okay, well, you can't make normative statements. You can't, he has a right to say that it is, normal to not bathe, right? Yeah. So remember the example I gave of the bottle. Changing would be like if I took this piece of paper off, I've changed it. But replacing would be like I take this and I replace it with this. Right? That is not possible. But a change in the fitra itself, it's possible. Right? And this gets into more when we get into the ontology of the human being. That gets into a lot of details that we probably don't have the answers to. So at this point, once we get to the ontology of the human being, which was? Yeah. Perhaps. By the way, there's two opinions which we're going to get into about the fitra, right? Like how does it function, right? So that is a possibility, right? But there's two interpretations, right? Again, the concept of the fitra is not like we have a crystal clear understanding. And that's really important, right? Because it's related to the ruh, it's related to the soul, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنْ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. We've only given you but a little bit of knowledge, right? Anyways, moving on. And there we go. All right, so we talked about original normatives. This was the ayah, right? And command them so they will slit the ears of the cattle, and I'll command them so they will change the creation of Allah. And so that's where I was talking about that, normative. All right, let's get to the last term. So we talked about original, normative, and now we'll get on to disposition. There are two main views, as I was mentioning. All right? So one view says that the fitra contains primary inborn knowledge of God's existence, that he deserves to be worshipped, and some basic morals. In other words, you are born with that knowledge. If that's the case, you cannot change the fitra, as you were saying, right? However, the fitra, the second opinion, says it does not contain knowledge. Rather, it directs one towards the truth, i.e. potency, disposed towards a recognition of God, primed to worship him. So one opinion says that you are born with that inborn knowledge. Okay? The other opinion says, no, the fitra inclines you, it's just a potency that you have to recognize God is one, God exists, and he's the only one worthy of worship. All right? So here we're talking about marifa. Yeah. But again, even the term marifa, there's a lot of debate and distinctions between them. So you have to be careful, right? Okay. So that could be. Yeah. So. But I'm actually inclined towards the second opinion, by the way. Reason being is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we took you out of the wombs of your mothers. What's the end of the ayah? Who knows? La ta'lamuna shay'a. Knowing nothing. Right? So it kind of gives a little more credence to the second opinion. But whatever opinion you follow, right? It's not here. We're not trying to dissect terms here. You can conceptualize the fitra. All right? So if you consider the fitra that it's inborn knowledge, there's clouds around it. Some people conceptualize it like that, right? So when people are going through doubts, their fitra, in fact, is like covered up like that, in a sense, okay? And so how do you uncloud that fitra? How do you bring it back to its original state or its original kind of disposition, all right? There are a number of ways, and you notice only one of those is rational arguments. Rationality can uncloud the fitra, but it is not the only tool you have. And this is something that if you take away anything from tonight, you have to understand that rationality is only one tool, only one way to bring the person back to that original normative disposition, that original state in which Allah created every human being. One way. There are a lot of other ways. So, revelation, the Quran and exposure to the Quran. Now, am I talking about the rational arguments of the Quran? No. That's in the section of rationality. I'm talking about the Quran that transcends just rational arguments. Because one thing that you'll notice about the Quran is that you don't find discursive reasoning. All right? What do I mean by discursive reasoning? Meaning, when we're talking about deductive arguments versus inductive arguments, that sort of structure you will rarely, if at all, find in the Quran. Right? A lot of times, even the argument for God's existence that's given that you can extract and extrapolate in a deductive form, in fact, is presented as a question. Right? In the sense that, were they created from nothing? Or did they create themselves, or did they create the heavens and the earth? Right? It's a deductive form, you can formulate it, but it's given in the sense of a question, in the form of a question. Okay? So my point with this slide is say, rational arguments can get you to a certain point, but you have other tools in your epistemic toolbox. Okay? So for example, experience. How many people think experience is a valid tool? Yeah, I'm sure you do. To determine truth, to uncloud the fitra, to bring the fitra back. Experience? Well, even bad experiences, though, I would say. Sure. Sure, okay. But what we're saying is that's more of an influence. We're talking about a direct first-person experience, right? Remember, influence is what their parents are doing from a third-person perspective. Here we're talking about a direct experience. Your own experience of, let's say, someone comes in, they're not a non-Muslim, and you invite them, look, join us in the salah. They're non-Muslim. They pray. That experience of the salah could be the thing that unclouds their fitrah. Because it's a first-person experience. Sure. 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 Are you sure? How do you know that? No, I'm kidding. So look, just to give you an example of experience. So there was a researcher by the name of Frank Jackson back in, is it Jackson or Johnson? Back in 1981. And he did a thought experiment. So philosophers love doing thought experiments. So this thought experiment is called Mary's Rule. Okay? In other words, he says that imagine you have a woman named Mary. And she's sitting in a room, and she's been in this room for her whole life. Now this woman, Mary, she has a PhD in neurology and neurobiology, okay? And she has a PhD in color theory. And she understands color theory better probably than anyone else on this planet. She's the foremost expert in color and the neurological process of how colors work. She's been in this room for her entire life, and the room has all been black and white. Okay? Everything around her is just black and white. There's no color. Okay? So now, she is the world's foremost expert. She knows everything there is to know about color. What happens if a person observes red? What are the neurological functions that happen? What areas of the brain light up? And so on and so forth. So she's the expert. But she's been in a room that's black and white for her whole life. All of a sudden, her monitor malfunctions, and boom, a red apple comes up. Has she gained something? Knowledge-wise. You see, here, it's the experience of red that she's gained. Is it real? Well, yeah. Has it added something? Yes. Is it knowledge? That's an open question. But clearly, there's something that's more than just the information that she has. So experience can uncloud the fitra, is what we're trying to say, right? The experience of beauty. I did a whole talk on this, if you're interested. And my argument with the experience of beauty is that when a person experiences natural beauty, it actually unclouds the fitra, right? And I don't want to get into it too deeply, but you can check it out online. But so natural beauty, trauma can actually uncloud the fitra, believe it or not. Okay? Yeah, uncloud. Think about it. Like, why does Allah sometimes put a person through trauma? Let's say a person's life is going great. Everything's going great. Right? Yeah. Because when things are going great, that's generally when people are far from Allah. I'm just saying, right? It's very difficult to be everything going well and you're just deeply connected to Allah. That's a difficult state. When do you become more connected to Allah? when all of a sudden something goes wrong. It's like I sometimes talk about there was a guy in California during 2008. He basically lost everything in the financial crisis, right? And basically he was saying that when I was leaving my house, like his billion-dollar house, whatever it was, I was driving away, took his kids out of private school. He said I was shattered basically. My whole life had just crumbled in front of me. He says, but as we were leaving, my kids and everything, we were moving somewhere else. We couldn't afford anything. We basically lost everything. This guy was like millionaire, right? I'm just crazy amounts of money. He says that I decided to stop by the masjid. He said, I walked into the masjid, I put my head on the ground, and I just started bawling. And he was actually telling this story to a sheikh, and he says, Wallahi, sheikh, that moment, that closeness that I had with Allah, in that moment, I would pay anything to get that again. Because I'd never been more close to Allah than in that moment, bawling my eyes out, right? So trauma can actually be a reason to uncloud the fitra and bring a person closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, human relationships, reflection, introspection, spirituality. How are we doing on time? Oh, yikes. Okay, spirituality. There is an argument that we're going to be making tomorrow. When we spoke about the limits of rationality, cognitive limitations, we're going to be looking at the concept that in order for someone to deal with doubts, you can use rationality, but it may not be a sufficient tool. Spirituality, by necessity, comes into play, okay? And when you go through the Quran, and this is an exercise you can do yourself as well, look at the ayat that speak about knowledge. You will see either directly in the ayah or around the ayah, there are some concepts related to spirituality. Always. إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. Right? Verily the ones who have khushu'a, have this kind of this awe and fear of Allah, that is a spiritual concept, are the people of knowledge. So knowledge and spirituality are connected throughout the Quran. And this is why, people like Imam al-Ghazali speak deeply about experience. In fact, by his thesis, rahimahullah, he in fact chalks it all up to experience. He says you can't get to certainty except by experience. And maybe there's some truth to that, right? So point being is that when we are looking to do away with doubts, now this is my last point, and we're trying to get to a level of certainty or get to certainty, we have to understand that it's not just a rational exercise. Rationality can help, but you by necessity need spirituality, right? And we're going to expound upon that more tomorrow, bi'idhnillah. Let me just quickly look at the other interpretation of the fitra. So we give the example of the car instead of the heart. So it inclines towards the truth, and so it's just a clouded window, all right? And that is it for tonight, inshallah. All right, everyone exhausted now? No? Hungry, all right. Let's go ahead and stop there. We can eat. I'll stick around if anyone wants to have questions or anything like that, join you guys, inshallah. JazakAllahkhair. I know that was a really heavy and intense session. Tomorrow's session will be lighter, inshallah. So we want to get the foundations out of the way that are heavy. Tomorrow, I promise, it's not going to be as dense, inshallah. What's that? No, can't do that, man. Like, no one is going to show up tomorrow then. Anyway, JazakAllahkhair. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's the same time, so it's going to be after Isha, and we'll probably go to about 10:15 or something, inshallah.